Got a fantastic episode for you this week with Tian Dayton. She's a phenomenal woman. She's been publishing on the topic of trauma and addiction for over 2 decades. She herself started early. She got into recovery at 14, having grown up with an alcoholic father. Her mother got into 12-step recovery and brought Tian with her. The main thing I took away from this conversation was Tian's stressing of the importance of developing our emotional literacy and how trauma maps out amongst the people in our lives in a process she calls sociometrics. She's a brilliant woman, fascinating storyteller, and I think you're going to love this. Let's go. Welcome to another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Tian Dayton. She is the developer of the model Relational Trauma Repair Sociometrics. And for those who've not heard of that, you'll certainly get into what all that means. Tian, you are an prolific author. When I was doing my research and going into Amazon, your books go all the way back to 1991. You published a book pretty much every year, right up until 2023, in the realm of trauma and psychodrama and recovery from addiction, all of the topics that have been very popular on this show. So it feels like a great honor to have you on the show. And of course, you're also a trainer in psychodrama and sociometrics, which again we'll get into. So a very warm welcome, Tian.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And for all those members of our audience who've not heard of you or your work, would you, very kindly give us a bit of your backstory and how you became interested in these topics that I just outlined?
Sure. I grew up with an alcoholic father, and we were sort of a typical. As I look back on it, it shifts. Every decade I see it differently. But right now I realize we were a very happy family, actually. And we liked being a family. And how dad's alcoholism began will forever be a subject of exploration. Was it his relationship with my mother? Was it the child they lost? Was it his own history of coming here at 17 years old from Greece with very little and working hard all his life, or much of his life? And, or was their family, all of it? It's a legacy. I won't go into his legacy, but the damage that alcoholism did in our family was constant. It is laced into the relationships we have to this day. It was devastating to have dad be an alcoholic. My parents divorced. It made it all the messier and the more crazy. And I have spent my life since pretty early, trying to get my family into treatment and trying to change myself. And I married a child of an alcoholic. So we discovered eventually that we could help each other, that we could pull together and get better from this thing that had no name when I started dealing with it. There weren't ACOA. We didn't have the word trauma.
What's that? What's ACOA for people?
Adult Children of Alcoholics.
Yeah.
That movement, codependency, none of that existed when my husband and I decided to enter the world of recovery from something I didn't know how to name.
Right.
But I was there.
Right. And so what age were you that you first sort of clicked and started to realize that you had this, issue from your childhood and wanted to do something about it?
I was 12. We were all in the living room, and my older sister said, "Dad, the doctor says if you don't go to treatment, you'll die within 2 years." It was a shocking moment. I ran upstairs everybody in the family followed me. My father, who I was very close to, said, "Look what you've done." Therein lies the rub. That's sort of the
Wow.
projection and so ever since then, and my mother joined Al-Anon when I was in my teens and got me familiar with that. And I tried a couple of Alateen meetings back then. I became a huge fan of Al-Anon and ACA meetings later. But she was introducing that thinking to
And again, what's Al-Anon? Al-Anon for people.
Al-Anon is for people who live with alcoholics. Then we only knew about alcohol. Now we
Right.
know any sort of addiction, and it would be for any spouse or child or anyone who's addiction, anyone who is concerned about someone who has an addiction.
Right.
And
And so did you, and when that happened, did your father, when you were 12, did he join AA or did he do anything about it?
he did go to, in those days you could commit people. He refused to go to treatment. My mother committed him. Men in white coats took him away. He went to a hospital, dried out. He was on a locked ward. And that lasted for a couple of weeks or so because Dad was an episodic drinker. And when he sobered up, he was very much himself and organizing all the patients for games. And he then went to Hazelden for treatment. And he left early and he stayed sober probably a week. And
Oh,
then he
okay.
really he did not enter recovery. He
Right.
died of disease when I was 23. And it was a sad and painful death. And by that time, I was handling it a lot myself, even though my older siblings were part of his life. But I really handled a lot of it myself. And that's trauma.
Yeah. That in itself is a trauma. Mm. Oh, wow. But at that age, were you, and maybe you didn't have the word trauma, but were you sort of, how familiar were you with that this isn't right, or this isn't normal, or this is an issue? Like, how cognizant were you of perhaps the toxicity or whatever word we want to use of the situation?
That's a very good question. Um, Partly,
Mm.
I endured my father. So much of my attention to him was that I was just losing my father. And
Right.
um, I knew why I lost him. I knew well enough to pin the doctors down. They said he had cancer. And I said, he had an esophageal tumor. And I remember I was 21, I think, no, I was 23. And I said, is this something you can get from alcohol? And they said, well, maybe. And I said, well, let me put it this way. Have you ever seen this in someone who drank? And they said, not the kind he had. And so I knew a lot.
Yeah.
And I knew, and then I got together with my husband shortly afterwards. And that's when I started getting my family into treatment because he was very treatment aware. He was sort of one of these kind of, we can do something about it, all a professional. So I did. And it freed me. All of our things freed me, but I don't think my family at that juncture was so able to see what kind of a problem we had that I thought we.
Right. So you had some level of, in fact, you were asking those questions of the doctors meant that you were sort of on that trail, right?
And I knew we weren't right.
Right.
Yeah, I'm the youngest, so I lived through my family just falling apart and my older siblings leaving, as they should for marriage and for work,
Mm.
But I had been on the ground for a lot of it. So I think they were able to sort of avoid it, though. That's what I learned. I thought maybe they got away from it, but they didn't. They carried it right with them and played it out in their own relationship. And it took me time to learn that, just as I did, just as we all did.
Yeah. But that's relatively early to get into recovery. So when you were sort of early 20s, you first went to a 12-step meeting, is that right?
Probably when I was 16.
Oh, when you were 16, even earlier. Okay.
My mother got me to go to Alateen, and I didn't love Alateen, but I did love the thinking of Al-Anon. My mother went to Al-Anon, so she used to tell me what she learned, and I loved I just incorporated it. She was my mother, and I was 16, so it became part of my thinking. I didn't even necessarily know I was thinking like an Al-Anon person.
Right. And so what did that give you then? What, in terms of how did that help shape your thinking as a 16-year-old?
It's such a good question. Maybe it gave me hope. Maybe it made me think if you don't have to live in the middle of something that is utterly broken, maybe it taught me that one other thing it taught me is I had better take care of myself.
Right.
Because no one was taking care of me. Even my mother, who was home, my parents were in such a state of collapse. My father was just drinking and he moved. And my mother was in a state of grief and shock. And she picked herself up within a period of time. But there were 2 or 3 years there was when I was a teenage caretaker and she didn't do anything for me. So I just learned to get a job. I learned to take care of myself and take care of her. Many of us learn that.
And you administering to your father as well, right? Who was in the
Not
throes of it.
really that what I tried, but then he kind of moved and disappeared, and then we were reconnected. We stayed close, but he was, I was trying to rescue him in every way I could, but it was a blessing that he died for both of us. It gave him a dignified exit, and it gave me the ability to not spend the rest of my life trying to rescue him.
Right.
But I'm in this field. So I'm trying to rescue everyone else.
Yeah. And then you met your husband, and he was also the
Well,
son of alcoholic.
together when we were young, and we hadn't seen each other for several years. So we got together at my cousin's wedding and his friend's wedding. And we just found each other, and we just knew it. And we've been together ever since. But I knew his mother. I knew his father. I was a child who spent the night at their house.
Oh, wow.
So I knew the people in his orbit who were once beautiful and healthy and then became sick. And we had a lot of comfort, I think, because we didn't have to explain all this to each other. And we just were, in love, one of those things.
Right. Right. And love and I think that, the difference you're describing is that you, from a very young age, were aware that these things being problems, right? Because a lot of people will go, their whole lives in denial that they're in a family with issues, right?
Well, my mother called it. She called it poorly. She called it in a crazy kind of way sometimes. But she did go to Al-Anon. She did call my father an alcoholic. She did try to get him treatment. So that took the burden. I'll tell you one thing that an awareness I have at this stage of life is that I think you can be in a mess of a life, but if you're not trying to hide it, the kids do all right. It's when you try to hide it and rewrite it and pretend it's not there. And my older siblings grew up with that. They grew up in the looking good family. I grew up in the family that was clearly a mess and wasn't. We thought we were kind of, grand, smart. And I remember just thinking, I think we got it wrong. I don't think we are. But I, the key is don't hide it, don't deny it, don't rewrite history. Because when you do that, the child gets screwed up. The stinking thinking or the distorted reasoning or the denying of feeling or the message that just don't, better if you don't. And If you do, I certainly don't want to hear about it. Those kinds of family messages, that's where the damage happens. I think if a
Interesting.
family calls in and cries and, you know, just, gets rid of all this feeling, even if you do it badly, even if you are kind of a mess, you're an authentic mess and you can find your way out. I had that benefit.
Your mum was starting to open up and talk about the mess of her life and
Yeah.
be honest with you,
Yeah.
in a way she wasn't with your older sibling.
Well, she wasn't because they were 6 and 8 years older than I.
Yeah.
So the family hadn't evolved. We did talk about it. It was my older sister who said, uh, "Dad, you'll die," but we didn't live through it. I had to live through both the collapse, and then I began to repair in my
Mm.
own way. Not because I knew how to repair. I found a job. I found that I had friends over once. I had one evening a week that I had called an at home, and I invite my friends in. Um, I did think I developed my own creativity, ingenuity, resilience, all those words now, but I see as I look back that must needs, I did what I had to do and it was good for me. I solved my life a little bit at a time.
Yeah. But I think, and this completely resonates with me, it's not until we accept, well, in my case, it was accepting how screwed up my family were, and my story about that, right? Like, and just had
Oh,
any kind of story about it, right? It's like how you said, it doesn't matter how it comes out, just even if it's inaccurate and it's got, if you start to talk about it in whatever way you can authentically, that's the beginning, isn't it?
oh, you bet. Once you once you lift that, iron gate, right?
Yeah.
Time you lift it, you really I think, it was a very hard gate to lift. My mother lifted the gate for me. I was just behind it,
Mm.
falling apart. But then when my husband and I were married and started running into those same things, I lifted that gate too, or we lifted that gate. And that was uh, hard in a whole different way because why were we living these things out when we didn't do anything? We don't drink, we don't use drugs. So, but then then it became fascinating. What is this thing that's relational trauma? And when Bessel van der Kolk's work came out in the 80s, I was just riveted. I mean, and then I knew how to treat it. By that time, I was using psychodrama. So I understood. I had always known psychodrama worked to treat pain, to treat grief. But then I understood why it worked to treat trauma. And I have spent my career integrating psychodrama and trauma and how to use it to heal trauma, not just to do, but to heal trauma specifically. And then I created floor checks that are part of sociometrics. And they're very easy to learn because I've done so much at treatment centers. I've done so much program development. And I really wanted to come up with an approach that therapists who don't have the training I have and don't feel like getting it can still give experiential healing to their clients, but it's easier to learn. And the clients like it. And that is floor check.
Brilliant. And I definitely want to talk all about that, but I'm so intrigued by your own story here. And
But I
so,
don't mind about
yeah, and you're so you hit your you and your husband are starting to open up. You're
Mhm.
both in the different recovery groups. When did you when did you start to become familiar with, well, this idea of trauma and pain, and when was it that you started to become, you know
When did
familiar
the
with
light
that,
go on?
and were able to go a bit deeper?
I will tell you when the light went on because I'll never forget it. We were having a fight. We had spent 5 years in an ashram. We were cleaned up, healthy, meditating, doing yoga. We were in great physical shape. And emotionally, it had helped heal us a lot too, those practices. And we had one child by this time, one baby. And babies act as triggers that, whatever you haven't worked out. Boy,
Oh,
you
I
don't.
know that.
Um, so we were having a fight and I saw him as just enraged with me, and I was just enraged with him. And I remember looking at he's an art dealer collector, and I looked at one of his beautiful paintings, and I thought I want to cut that painting to just show him how much this is hurting me. And then I sort of saw myself thinking that, and I said, Brant, I just had this awful thought, and I think there's something wrong with us. I don't think this is our fight. I think that's what dawned on me. I thought I really loved him. It's not that didn't have our issues, but we really got along. I was very unambivalent about being married to my husband. And I just thought, we're fighting. You're talking. Somehow I knew he was talking to his mother and I was talking to my son. And that this wasn't, I got it. And then after that, I read a book called I'll Quit Tomorrow by Vern Johnson. We visited his mother. We lived in the Poconos at the time. We visited his mother, who had this beautiful apartment on Fifth Avenue and just an idyllic world. But she was sort of wandering around it on pills and on, So, yeah, and we had our baby, and I was there with her a lot, taking care of our daughter, and he was off working. So it got so weird that at one point I just looked at him and said, I'm leaving. I'll just take Marina and join me when you're finished with your work, but I'll go back home. And it was a snowstorm. I didn't realize it because New York, there was no snow. And I curled up with Marina, and for 2 days till Brant came back, I found this book on the shelf, I'll Quit Tomorrow, and I read it twice from cover to cover. Which, if you've ever taken care of a baby, you're reading every hour that they're sleeping, because the rest of the time I was taking care of her. And I realized that I needed the first step, and that at that point we just knew I'm powerless over alcohol, But I thought, I'm powerless over something alcohol did to me. I'm powerless over something else. So I just started kind of working my own steps, surrendering, and that's how I started. And then once I became willing, then everything opened up.
Right. And when you say willing to do what? What were you willing to do?
Willing to not be perfect. Perfect's a wrong word. Willing to not be where I wanted to think I was. Willing to see that there was damage inside, willing to see that we were living something out.
Yeah.
And then actually we moved to London after that. We sort of took a hiatus and had just a wonderful 2 years living in London. And then I came back to New York and I thought, I really need to do something about this. Because we should have stayed in London. But anyway, so I dealt with it. My mom knew someone who was named Sharon Wegscheider Cruz, who was writing books and doing workshops. And I went to that. I was 35 at that time. And from that point on, I discovered psychodrama. I was 31. I'm sorry. I was 35 I was 31 at the time. And then my life I went Al-Anon, I got a therapist, I did everything.
Okay. And what were these? What started happening in these workshops then? What?
Well, they used psychodrama, which is how I came to know how powerful healing it was. And I remember one scenario in which they just had me sculpt the family. Who could play your father? Who could play your mother? Where are they standing? And they put my father up on a little elevation. And I said, oh, no, my father was not elevated. We didn't look at him. And they said, oh, yeah, but he had a lot of power through his addiction. And I sort of said, okay. And then they looked at me and handed me a bataka. And I said, oh, that's not ladylike. And then, that's what, like a bat?
Right.
He'd been talking to everybody. I had been talking to everybody for 10 or 15 minutes. And it felt great to say the truth to them, right? But I couldn't say in real life. I could say through these surrogates.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, and I just thought, oh, I don't have, enough anger to. And then they said, well, just give it a try. I just, wow. So, I mean, I was just wildly, I loved Bataka work after. I didn't know I had that kind of anger
And
inside.
what was this, like a dummy, or was there some guy
Yes,
who
yes.
was just
Oh,
taking it?
a pillow.
Okay.
A pillow. Sorry, that's an important detail.
Yeah, I was just we'd have added to the drama if
It's
it
a
were.
clinical sort of, it's part of rage work, it's called.
Yeah.
And I do it sometimes, I don't as a clinician, but it certainly felt good to me because I had so much historical stuff pent up. And I could acknowledge it and not have to pretend it wasn't there. And that more than that, I had a physiological catharsis and I got rid of it in my body. I moved through the frozenness that polyvagal theory talks about. I moved through the my body armor. I just let my body go. And I remember afterwards I had sort of a dance, as part of the 5-day. It was like letting go and just putting on music. And I just remember just leaping all around and kicking my legs up and just, not wanting to talk to anybody, just wanting to move. And movement is a part of my model. It is always a part of what I do, because if you don't move your body, you don't access the limbic world and get it warmed up so that you can move through it. It's not just words that heal trauma. We want to think, we want to change our thought. We want to say, just think about a new thing, or, you've got choices, or things that don't really, they help, but you've got to have a physiological shift at some point. And there needs to be movement and the body needs to be involved. Call it embodied therapy. There are many.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that completely aligns with my experience. And so you're whacking your father, right, on the pedestal with the
Or
bataka. Was that the word?
my something. Yes, it was called a bataka. I think I was just whacking the whole system.
Right. Interesting.
Disease. I think they said just towards the disease. There's that thinking in our world, separate the disease from the person, which is helpful to me because I adored my father and I was very close to him. That's why it was so heartbreaking to lose him. But you don't lose an alcoholic once. You lose them a day at a time. And it's horrible.
Yeah. And that started to open you up. And then you found that you what
way more than started. I was just, I mean, it
boom.
was, yeah.
And you just you followed that through. You found therapists. You continued to do that type of
I knew
work.
what to do because I was, I think by that time, I was finishing my master's at that point.
In what?
And, my master's was in educational psychology and my doctorate in clinical psychology. But I was sort of shifting during my master's to get more interested in the psychology part. And as I say, my mother knew of this 5-day thing. I had already dragged my family into treatment with this woman, Sharon, before I moved to England. Dragged the whole family in our house and said, come on, we need to do something. We're not what we should be. And what happened was we did a form of psychodrama, but I didn't really realize it then. But even that was so freeing.
Right.
And what happened, I freed myself. I didn't necessarily sort everything out with my family members, but I stepped out of I gave myself permission to step out of the system.
Right.
Even though I'm.
Yeah. And then as you started to do this work on yourself, then what shifted in your life? How did your life change?
I developed first of all, I developed the capacity to feel my feelings. So that's a big one. That's what all therapy really is trying to do, is help people tolerate or be with their inner world and their inner state that are painful, anxiety provoking. And this is both, we're talking physiological and emotional and psychological. We want to separate it. It's all one big thing. I mean, our neurological wiring is carrying physiological messages, emotional messages, and then we make sense of them on the way out, actually.
Yeah.
So, so there was that ability to now at least recognize that sitting with those produced something. And then there was learning a language for them. There was learning to name them, feel them, name them, talk about them. And then there was learning to listen as somebody else. That was about a decade later, I think. I think first I was just, I couldn't believe, I couldn't believe it, that a therapist could sit and listen to me. I had so much to say. Boy, did I have a lot to say. And I did need to pay someone to listen to that because, who wants to listen to all that?
Yeah.
And Al-Anon meetings were like a limbic bath. They were like, hey, once this thing gets rolling, right? Once you open up the Pandora's box, you really need a holding environment. So I'm in New York. I was in New York City at the time, and there's Al-Anon everywhere. And funny Al-Anon meetings, wonderful Al-Anon meetings, talented Al-Anon, they're just great. So I just had access to a meeting every day if I needed one. And my children were by this time, I think, in school. So I could fit it in. And I could fit studying in. But recovery really took time and energy. And although, because I had these meetings and a therapist, I could bookmark everything. I could tell myself, I'm going to need to talk about that, but I had places to go to talk about it. So I didn't have to just dump it everywhere in my life. In fact, I became quiet and more focused in my regular life. It freed up energy and I was able to focus where I wanted to. But I knew I had these safe places to talk.
Right. And how did things shift with your husband at that period?
Well, I think we learned to, actually, it took him a couple of years to start doing those things. When I started Al-Anon and this kind of 5-day program and so on, I thought he might be fine. This might just be me. So I'll just go and take care of myself. And then after about 2 years, I said, you're not fine. You need this too. And so then he jumped in the same wholehearted way. And it was rocky. I mean, it's rocky to be, I think you have to make the decision when you do that. And for me, this was almost an impossible decision, but I've got to choose myself in this, not in a selfish, awful way, but I can't let myself really enter a program of healing. I don't know where I'm going to come up.
Yeah.
And I thought there could be a possibility we would come out somewhere different.
Right.
And that was very scary, but I remember having to sort of accommodate that idea. And then we slowly, and I emphasize slowly, developed the ability to talk things out. And I would say we're still developing that, but I think what we're pretty good at is knowing after being married for 48 years that, fighting is sort of point. It's good to have an altercation if you need to say things you need to say, but there's no point in working it too hard because we're going to make up anyway. So at some juncture, about 15 years ago, I think we just sort of thought, why don't we just skip that part and then just make up now and, have a nice day.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, you talk about children being triggers as well, and the relationship. Presumably, were you starting to see patterns in the relationship and how they were triggering, old pain and unresolved trauma?
I have all kinds of stories about that. I will see if I can select a couple, but basically, I had been a trained Montessori teacher in all of this also before all of this. So that had taught me how to be a good parent. It was a remarkable training on parent. And I think I had
I'm sorry, what kind of teacher again?
Montessori, Maria.
Oh, Montessori, yeah.
And my daughter was the easiest child you could ever imagine raising. She was just heavenly. And then my son came along and he was all boy. and much more challenging for a woman, but so adorable and charming and fun that that's New York. So I had two good, solid little kids, right? And they were triggering. I knew that if I got triggered, it was probably me, and that the first place to look was in me. So if they triggered, but my family was happy when I was young. So I didn't get so triggered when they were little. It's when they got older. I know one time when about at the same time as my daughter's becoming not a teenager, but an adolescent, that's when things started to go south for me. Actually, they started earlier, but they started much earlier, more fourth grade, third grade, second grade as I go back. But when my daughter got to that stage, I remember we were having just an altercation, and there was a look on her face. And this is the fear I carried as a mother, that I would somehow make her feel the way my mother made me feel, which was rejected and, not chosen as, maybe down the line choice. And I looked at her in the middle of a fight and I thought, oh my God, I am giving her every bit of power I have. And she may never talk to me again. But I had to be honest with her. I just said, Marina, I looked at her face and the look of hurt on her face. I knew that look. And I thought, I put that look there in what I said. I put it. And I said, Marina, I'm so afraid you're going to grow up and feel about me the way I feel about my mother. And in the middle of a fight, she looked at me and she said, and while she had every reason to be mad and say, I will, she said, why would I feel that way about you? I've seen the way your mother treats you and you've never treated me that way. So why would I feel that? And that was a completely shape-shifting moment in my life. So I thought maybe I'm not repeating as much as I'm repeating. I repeated too much, and I wish I could change certain things. But then the trick as they get older becomes apologize. Usually apologize.
Yeah.
And the other thing is now my children are adults and having their own children who trigger them. So then they get in touch with what I did wrong
right.
And they just need to say it. And they don't say it in the way that it's getting triggered in me. They say it in a way that hurts to hear it and hurts them it's hard for them to say. And because they don't want to hurt me. But it's stuff that's stuck inside. And I've just learned, I just have to live through listening to it and apologize and own it.
Yeah.
Children are the most forgiving people on earth.
Yeah.
They've got the nicest children you could wish for. But that doesn't mean they don't need to share with me when I go too far or when I went too far or when I hurt them and that sort of thing. So that's sort of how. Do you want me to give you another story about how things get repeated?
Yeah, no, I think this is so valuable for people who are parents themselves or are figuring out their own relationship with their parents.
Well, in psychodrama, we have in sociometry something called the social atom, kind of like a family map. And one time, Alex was changing in schools, and I was convinced he was not meeting people and having friends. So I would call the school and say, is my son making a good transition? Does he have friends? And literally they said, oh, he has friends. I would say, and the answer was always, he's one of the best kids in the class. He's one of the most popular kids. He's never, and then I'd call again. Well, Mrs. Dayton or Tian, no, he's never alone. Actually, he's got his arms around his friends. He's high-fiving everybody, every hallway. And then I'd call again, and they were so patient and nice. So anyway, about the third phone call, I thought, what's going on with me, right? So I had changed schools. We got to live in Athens for a year as a family. And I had a very rough...
In Athens in Greece?
Yes, in Athens in Greece.
Oh, cool.
And I had a rough first 3 months, right? And I didn't have friends. After that, it was fine. But I had never worked out the pain of those 3 months. And I did a social ad of my life when I moved. And then I thought, okay, I'm just layering the trauma of my life onto Alex. He's fine. He's got friends coming out of it. He's got a ton of friends. So those are the ways. It's not like a huge thing that wasn't even a huge trauma. It was just a difficult adjustment.
Yeah.
So there are many ways we pass down pain. And if we're willing to, do you want me to give you 2 more examples?
Go for it. Yeah, no, I'm loving it. Yeah.
One client had a father who left her, and I knew this history when she was 6 months old. She started wanting to distance her child at about this stage. It's just there was a bonding issue. Not profound, just something and I reminded her about her father, and the light bulb went on. And then she could walk past, she could move past, give herself, she could understand herself.
Yeah.
And then she said, I've got to call my friend. And she did call her friend because her friend, and so her friend had been being incredibly anxious about her 3-year-old daughter. And when she told her friend, she reminded her friend that they had left, I can't remember what country it was, Iran or something, when they were 3. They had fled. So the daughter was fine. The daughter had lived in the United States, very happy life. The mother, that's called an age correspondence reaction. And this in parenting, if you understand that's one thing, it will free your child from a lot of therapist appointments. So one person's reaction was to distance because of the trauma she didn't want to feel. The other person's was to cling and get anxious. And those are the 2 sides of trauma, right?
Yeah.
Anxious clinging, alternating between rejection and that kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true, isn't it? And you see it play out in much more tragic circumstances where people will often die at the same at the same age that their
Yes.
parents had died, right?
Yeah. You've got it.
In things like car accidents, right? Where it's
Yeah.
it's
Well,
this pattern.
parent who's suicide, then you get to that age and, you've already think.
Yeah. It's uncanny, but it makes sense once you
Uncanny.
and understand it.
And it's from babies. I had a mother who had birth trauma, and I was just saying this on another podcast. She had birth trauma, and she was left in the hospital by her mother, who went home to the other children because they knew her. They would miss her. But the baby in her mind is just a little lump and wouldn't miss her. Well, not so much. So about 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, the hospital said, come get your baby. And she did. And then the baby was embraced and loved and cared for. However, that recorded that separation in that baby at a very critical moment. When that woman grew up and had a child, she also had birth trauma, and she left the child in the hospital. She didn't have to go home to her other child. She could have, spent part of it, but she came to visit the baby once an hour a day, which is in a baby's world is different from 24.
23 hours without your mother. Extremely traumatic.
But also thinking, well, he doesn't really know me yet. He won't miss me, my other. All just repeated word for word.
Yeah.
With no knowledge, no understanding.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So what you were finding so back to your story, then you're going through your 30s and you're starting to notice these triggers with your children, and now you've got tools to work on them.
So then your family becomes a sort of grist for the mill of healing, spiritually healing, because there's nothing more motivating than to try to get better for the sake of your children, or to try to get better for the sake of your marriage, And I think one of the hard things with a marriage, it's one thing to try to get better for your children. Many of us can move our ego aside for that. Not everybody by any means, but many. But for your spouse, that's a pretty naked feeling. And I think that the level of vulnerability, especially for people who learn to mistrust, because ACOAs we learn how to mistrust while acting like we trust. We learn how to trust while like really mistrusting. We get it all confused. So it's not only do you have to go a layer down, you have to untwist the wiring from all these developmental stages. And that can feel like you are, your insides are being, your intestines are being pulled out through your ears, But if you can get there, and if you can take that leap of faith, and if you can say, I'm going to trust enough, I'm going to take a risk and trust enough. I don't have to trust perfectly, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I'm going to stop projecting everything onto you and take a look at myself and see if my overreaction has an historical component, which it generally does. If you're in an overreaction that's outsized for what's going on in the present, look for your history. In program, they say if it's hysterical, it's historical. It's a great slogan.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And in my experience, that trust is a trust that I'll be okay experiencing my own pain.
Well, you just put your finger on it better than I did, actually, because that's the real trust. Will I be okay if I feel my own pain? And that's where the need to project and make it about somebody outside the self. And your spouse is just standing there, they're kind of a sitting. But you're absolutely right. It's not the other person. It's trusting yourself that you can come out of reach experiencing those feelings.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
And it's and the trust is, and that in my experience, that reticence is not misplaced, right? When I have felt my own pain, it's disruptive. It's, of course, it feels. I mean, when they've looked at these measurements of the brain and the same pain centers, like the same centers of the brain light up, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, we have this uncomfortable experience, and the rewards on the other side are, transformative, and as you say,
right? Transformative. You feel so much lighter, and you can give yourself permission to get out of things that hurt and to get into things that feel good. ACOA families train us to stay in for the death knell. I mean, they train us to keep trying and trying and trying. And there is something in between trying and sacrificing yourself and moving to the other side of the world and not talking to no one. You can, some of the research on ACOA by Sybil and Stephen Wolin, they talk about ACOAs who thrive relocate themselves at what they call the magical 200-mile radius. So they are close to their families. They can stay connected, but they're not in the everyday stuff. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You've got to
become adaptive.
Yeah. And it's hard to do because your families don't support it.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was probably about 200 miles in my early healing. I was about 200 miles apart. I mean, and my parents weren't alcoholics, but my father was a rageaholic and my mother was emotionally avoidant. So I completely resonate with people who had alcoholic parents. Sorry?
Similar dynamic.
Yeah.
It's all the questions as if your father supported the family, then I don't know if he did, but that gives him an extra power. Yeah.
But it was, what I resonate with is the distance I felt from my father and the destructive patterns, right? He didn't get drunk, but when he raged, it was similarly disruptive to somebody being in, an alcoholic state. And then there's that distance. It's very hard to close to be someone who's not constantly raging, but very frequently raging.
That's awful. Frequent rage. It's a bad thing.
But but back to your 200-mile, what I found was over time, the more therapy I did and the more deep work I did, the easier and easier it was for me to be around my parents. I now live 6 miles away from them and it's fine. So, but wow. I did need a number of years, 200 miles away. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. May I ask, how did you turn that tide?
Just lots and lots and lots of deep work. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
see, people talk about boundaries. I think this is the reason I asked. And I think you're a perfect example of internal boundaries. You develop the internal ability to feel all that stuff and to process all that stuff, which naturally gives you a sense of when it's too much and when you need to remove yourself, I'm guessing, and when you need to seek something different or take a different action, which in effect is a boundary, but it's an authentic boundary instead of just setting an arbitrary boundary.
Yeah, and I also got to a certain point where I felt like continuing to avoid having them in my life was actually uh, not allowing me to grow, because and a friend of mine described it as stirring the pot. Right, I had to re-engage to give myself the triggers to give me more fuel for the healing. I was kind of whilst they were still alive, and I had. It sounds a weird way of putting it, but it was like they became, a resource for my own healing. And of course, the benefit was I could build relationships with them. So it's not they won from it, but yeah.
I think you're saying a very profound thing because there's nobody who triggers us like the people who shaped us, and if you can manage that,
yeah, and it took a while. So I started living close by to them, and maybe I could do like 10 minutes, and then I'd have like crippling irritable bowel for like the rest of the day. But in a weird way, I kind of welcomed it. I was like, okay, right, let's work on this, and then I can heal it. And then it got to be I could do like 10 minutes with no irritable bowel, and then it would be like 20 minutes, and then it would be half an hour, and now I can spend the whole day with. So yeah,
I had a moment like that with my mother, because what you're saying is, I feel like you should just edit out what you're saying and make it go viral. It's so valuable. But my mother, we went to this sort of thing that her daughters, my brother didn't come because it was a kind of a girls' spa. Sort of, we'd always land in the same hotel and do spa stuff. And so we did that for a few years in a row. And I remember one time my mother who never made me one meal in the entire time we were by ourselves in the house, no lunch money, no sandwich, no dinner, nothing. So we were we had piled into a bus to go somewhere on this island. And my mother came in with a box lunch that everybody had taken. It said, Tian, you forgot your lunch. And the rage that came up in me, I wanted to really, I saw myself wanting to stand up and say, that is not my mother. Don't be fooled by this, I wanted to just shout to everybody that this imposter was using me to pretend she had been a good mother. And then I thought, well, that might not get me anywhere right now. So I thought, what if I let myself have the mother I always wanted for 5 days? Just to see if I could feel it, just along the lines of what you're saying, just to see if I could actually still take in the love of a mother, even if it's not going to last for the rest of the year because she can't do it. Even if it's a narcissistic kind of faux love, I need it. I need what I can get. So I did that. And I was really able to do it. And I didn't want to call her out. I didn't want to run around, passing notes to everybody at the spa that she wasn't really like this and all insult her in front of people. I didn't need to do that. And in the last 5 years of her life, we became really good friends. I just loved being with her, and she just loved being with me. And I think that's those perfect. 5 days, just the willingness, just what you said you were doing. I moved back, only that's how I moved.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I think it's worth considering for people who have found a kind of equilibrium where they've created, a big distance between them and their family. When it feels right and when they feel like they've got the support to consider, increasing the dosage, the exposure, and the benefit it might give you.
Yeah, because what you said, that was the next level of your growth.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then the boundaries is right. And one of the reasons, I think there are two reasons why I'm able now to spend much more time with my parents. One is I've just done a lot more of the deep work, and there's just less pain in my system to get triggered. But equally, on a practical level, I've just become much more skilled at managing my boundaries, when to not engage in certain conversations. And what's wonderful about that is it takes a bit of effort to begin with until the people around you learn the boundaries. And then you have to enforce them less and less, because it's like a Pavlovian response. They know just not to go into certain territories. They've unwittingly sort of trained themselves around your new boundaries.
One thing, profound thing after another, one after another. That's exactly how it happened.
Mm.
People you didn't think would ever retrain are kind of glad to be retrained.
Yeah. I think you're right. They may at some level be glad at, they might not consciously be glad of it, but yeah, that's been my experience.
Good for you.
Yeah. But back to your work then. So when did you start? So obviously you're doing a lot of this work yourself. When did you start to develop your own kind of approaches and models? In the domain that we've been talking about.
There was an exact moment. I had psychodrama training groups for years, right? I trained clinicians how to do psychodrama, how to do some minor sociometric exercises like spectrogram and locogram.
And sociometrics, again, just for people who are I know you've touched on it.
Psychodrama sociometry group psychotherapy is developed by J.L. Moreno and later by Zerka Moreno. Turn of the century Vienna, but from Jacob, and from 1930 something on 5, I think, with Zerka. And then JL died in 73 and Zerka died fairly recently. So I never met JL, but I trained for many years with Zerka, his wife. So I'm a trainer of this method, and I had training groups. And the budgets in the 80s were cut so that my trainees, some of them, were given 30 and 35 people in a group. And they said, here, it's managed care, go and heal them, give them a healing experience. And we were all he wanted to quit. He was so desperately distressed that he couldn't possibly do that. And I thought, the whole group was just sort of going, what a tough situation. But I thought, if anybody should be able to solve this, it should be someone who understands sociometry. Because Moreno's quote is, in a group, each person becomes the therapeutic agent of the other. So it became my task in my mind, how do I create an approach that allows each person to become a therapeutic agent for the other over and over and over again in a group context, but that doesn't require a lot to learn how to do. And that isn't too high stress or activating for the client, so that things get too involved and hard to manage for the clinician and for the group members, to triggering all the way around. I came back the next, we used to do things called feeling checks in the addictions field. And they were all sort of a pet peeve of mine. You'd go around the group and, I'm excited, I'm dead, I'm scared. And I just thought I felt like I was in Mickey Mouse Club. They used to do things like that. And also, nobody was genuine. I mean, or maybe 50% of people were genuine and 50%, were just trying to come up with a word.
Well, interestingly, just to point out that for me was a massive breakthrough, because I started going to Codependence Anonymous. So yeah. And I remember having these bingo charts. It was like, pick something that you feel. And I started off in 12th. All I could ever say when we did those rounds was like, I'm fine. And I couldn't understand how I could say anything other than fine, right? And it was like, why all these people got all these feelings? Like, what's going on, And then people started giving me these cards, and I'd be like, oh, okay, right. And I'd just like pick one. But you talk about emotional literacy in the book that I've not read some of, Trauma and Addiction. And that was a massive gift for me, just to be able to say, like, I am anxious, or I am sad, or I am frustrated, because I hadn't put those sentences together before. So interesting you had that reflection on them, because for me, it really, in some ways, marked the start of my serious inner work.
So I have a question to ask you.
Yeah.
First of all, they were on cards. That's not what I was, not where my pet peeve is. Secondly, were you able to choose the card?
Well, no, you had this big acetate A4 sheet with maybe like 40 feeling statements on.
Yes.
And then you picked one of them. That was how it worked.
That's what I've created experientially. So you
Oh,
and
okay. Fine. All right.
you're
So
on
we took it cross
exactly
purposes.
the same thing. That's the whole point of floor check. For
Mm.
example, I came in the next week with feelings on cards, right? And I put them all over the floor so that would engage people. They'd get up and move. They'd get out of their chairs. They'd connect with each other. And said, okay, walk over to a feeling you're experiencing right now. So I'm extending what was a breakthrough for you, and it's just adding the body. But but the way you did it was just the sitting in the chair version of what I do experientially.
Okay.
What I don't like is when there's no choice, when there's go around one by one and just, and I guess there was choice, but it didn't feel like it. It didn't feel like it.
Right.
Anyway, enough of my pet peeves. I'm just telling you why I did this. So I thought, what would happen if I put them on the floor and let people choose and walk over to them and share a sentence accompanying the feeling? And everything, that group is burned into my mind. It was in the 80s, but it became magic. And I had no idea it would become so magic because the group was so beautiful and brilliant. And they would turn. Then I tried to walk over to a feeling you don't like feeling.
Ah, great.
I understood trauma enough to know I was doing a sort of soft. I understood trauma a lot before I read all the literature because I experienced enough of it. But I knew feelings we avoid aren't good, So then people start to talk about what they avoid and then walk over to a feeling that you don't like when you see it, experience it with someone else. Well, that's relational, right? I can't stand when I'm around somebody who's anxious. Walk over to a feeling that your family of origin couldn't feel. My family just couldn't feel angry. Or walk over to a word that your family of origin used to get stuck in that describes an area that gets stuck. So that's a feeling floor check. I now have about hundreds of floor checks.
Okay.
Because you can deal with manifestation. In other words, anger. I put manifestations all over the floor. Some people just think anger is anger, right? But it's cynicism, negativity, stonewalling. So that it's a way of teaching and healing simultaneously. And it's very easy to learn to do for the clinician. And it's fun for the client because if it's a big group, back to the beginning, they can talk to each other. So people who chose manipulation for anger can talk to each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So then it becomes even a deeper healing, and that reticence that we all have. Well, most people have, opening up. If somebody has no reticence, that's a little diagnostic too. There's a natural reticence that we have, but if you put people in smaller constellations or clusters, the reticence goes away, and then they form bonds which strengthen the whole community because the individual bonds strengthen the group bonds. So plus it does. I use the subjects that are being taught in treatment, like trauma. I will put trauma symptoms on the floor because I used to teach trauma symptoms, and I'd look around and people were just literally going like this. Some would be like that and think they had every symptom. Some would be just tuned out. I mean, it wasn't a good way to teach them. I tried putting them on the floor and adding movement and choice so that they don't feel. And one of the questions could be, which one are you feeling? Which one do you not feel? Which one don't you identify with? So
Right.
you have permission. I really, hypervigilance, I really identify with, but distorted thinking, not so much. So you start to build a kind of a resilience and an autonomy. It's very simple to execute, very simple, but it goes a long way in groups.
And I can imagine it brings a little bit of fun, right? Because you got
people laugh and they pat each other. I've done this with 1,000 people. And that was the biggest group I'd ever done this with. And I thought, oh, what's going to happen? But it was just marvelous because there were all 1,000 didn't stand up, but maybe 700 did. So it's 750. So there were that many people choosing a word, and then they'd be clustered around each other and laughing and getting tearful and patting each other on the back. And then the other beauty of it is the feelings have a beginning, middle, and an end. You share it and then you're done and you move into another choice. And we have a lot of trouble with that sometimes with trauma, leaky feelings. The other thing it trains you to do is listen to other people as they share theirs.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which is also hard to do. And
you said earlier it took you a decade. I think I'm still working on mine. Might take me a couple of decades.
The listening part, without exploding, imploding, wanting to hide, wanting to shout, all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that sounds extraordinary to have 1,000 people in the room. Yeah.
Yes, I've got videos of it on the site you'll put on your RTO sociometrics. So it's really fun. I'm so pleased about how now it's been 30 years, so I really know how it works.
Wow. Yeah. And I can just see how that's a very easy way into this, right?
That's it. And that's what I wanted to give people. An easy, merciful, lighthearted way into this deep work so that they can understand, because I got into it that way. I had fun learning about all this.
And it's starting at the building block of emotional literacy, it seems to me. Right? And you can't, I couldn't have done any of my much deeper trauma work if I hadn't sat in those early rooms and being able to say, I feel frustrated, right? That was like, I could never have got, my work is healing, birth trauma, but I could never have got there without those first steps.
And, everybody's different, because when I started Al-Anon, I remember thinking that I would start talking and the room would just empty, that I would start saying what I was really feeling and that people would just politely pick up their bag and leave. And I'd be babbling to an empty room because that was my experience. Yeah. So I didn't need anything except to be able to talk those 3 minutes and not clear the room for the first year to heal. Yeah. Everybody's different.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that's that. So you called this what was it? The term for that moving around the room and
floor checks. And they're
floor checks. Yeah. I
yeah.
Yeah. And that's a key part of relational trauma repair sociometric.
It's the core part.
It's the core part. And what other aspects of it then have you brought into that? Right?
Timelines. I do social atoms timeline, trauma timeline, resilience timeline. Again, those are videos of those on that website if people are curious. Social atoms for anything. Like I do a social atom of a frozen moment. To just do a family map sort of social atom of a moment when you froze. Now that is trauma work because, and I only did it out of desperation once again, that people kept bringing the more I got known for doing trauma work, because I was just on the road a lot, the more people were coming up and wanting me to do their trauma drama. And I didn't realize that shift was happening in the way people perceived me and the way people were operating in the field. Right. So out of desperate, and then they'd freeze it all over again. I would sculpt their family system with them, and they, so finally, and that hadn't been happening to me for the previous 15 years, so I really didn't, or 10 years, whatever. But when out of desperation, I said to this large room in Las Vegas, I remember, do a moment when you froze. And literally, I watched like 200 people go. They kind of went, they all knew what it meant. And then they owned their own frozenness. And then the work began with them owning that moment and already surfacing it as something they wanted to look at, not having it blindside them as I was structuring their generic plan.
Right. And then when it comes to, so this what you're describing, this way I experience is it's going to help people to start to engage with their past. It's going to help people make sense of it, figure out what was going on at different stages, and then the sort of core healing of it. And what's the sort of am I right that there's another layer down, and if so, what is it?
I'm not sure.
Because my sense is that people may then feel like they want to go a bit deeper, perhaps do the type of work you've spoken about with the
I see
vocabulary.
what you
The is that
That's a
right? Is
good
there?
question. You know what? I'm still sort of wondering. I am more open-minded now than I've been in the past. Thinking, you should when I had my practice, now I have a training practice. But when I clinical practice, right? So you can come to group with me if you get a one-to-one therapist, you are in 12-step program, and you are going to change your eating habits and at least try to get some healthy eating. And if you smoke, you're going to try to quit. And I would just say, if you don't have to quit before you come, but just know you will let grow very fast at all if you smoke. And of course, if you're eating badly, it's not good. And you will exercise. That was the other big one. You will. If I did that, people almost always got better. If they did all those things. The ones who stopped doing a couple of them were the ones who didn't get better. So this needs to become almost a new design for living. Now, that you don't have to be in group therapy forever or therapy forever. Some need to be in program forever, some don't. But you do need a change in lifestyle that's forever. And in program, people call it a new design for living. You have to live differently. And so that's number one. If you do that, you just you get life, life on life's terms. And in terms of deeper work, I love psychodrama. But there are a lot of ways to do deep work. And I don't think one is just, I think for trauma healing, psychodrama is my favorite. The people heal in all kinds of ways. I mean, people have wailing walls. I remember working with this population and thinking, my population of traumatized people needs to have a wailing wall. There's a lot of wisdom in a wailing wall. You need to go somewhere and just let it out in a very unbridled kind of a way, and then go back to your life. I think. I don't know if a wailing wall is exactly what you need, but you need to be able to, who is it? Pablo Neruda talks about we need to dance our clumsy dance and sing our sorrowful song. It's a, it's
a
just so
dance and sing our sorrowful song.
Pablo Neruda. Just such a beautiful way of expressing that we all have to. There's no getting problem free. There's no getting trauma free. Where this is an incredibly vulnerable experience of life. So we need to develop the tools to process things as they come up, not once and for all, but as they come up, and to know when we need a little more help. To know when you need to go back to program or see a therapist for a couple months or a year, or to know when you need support and know when you don't. My kids' generation use therapy differently. They do things as they need them, much more.
Right.
And then they stop and then they go again if they need it,
Yeah.
But they have an emotional language that we just did not begin to have.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, my kids are starting to learn to express feelings, like being taught by their teachers to express feelings. In their first year of school. I mean, that's
I'm doing
a sign of the
flirting
time.
for kids now too, because I think not that they need them. If you give them permission to feel, they tell you. I mean, my grandchildren are so. Our grandson is 10 3/4, as it says, and my husband was on a Zoom with him recently, and he was kind of barraging him with questions, and I thought, why are you asking him so? And I hear Risa say, you're asking a lot of questions. I mean, they just feel free to say what their experience is. I wouldn't have dared say something like that.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of things happen just because they have an emotional language, and they don't. Things don't fester. They don't build up. They get rid of it. And they have the language to talk about it.
Yeah.
They're very articulate, these little ones.
Yeah, absolutely true. And then, of course, the big trigger for me is when in this scenario I find myself shutting them down out of some perceived need in that moment, and then it's
I think of the times I did it, but
Yeah, that's definitely my edge right now that I'm working on. Yeah, yeah. But no, I love your answer to that deeper work. And this is what's been fascinating in doing this podcast, and now nearly 300 episodes. Yeah, there are dozens of ways in which people have reported on this podcast getting well and releasing their trauma, whether it's the plant-based, whether it's the breathing, whether it's jumping in ice. But there's so many different ways to heal, but perhaps what's in common with all of them is in some ways it helps you connect with yourself at a deeper level and engage the emotional body.
I used to think, I mean, I still think that the psyche has a very similar healing pattern as skin. If you cut yourself, you, I remember I broke a bone in my foot, and I asked the doctor how they would find each other. And he said, oh, there. And he explained to me, and he drew it. And he said, all of these things go out and those pieces of bone find each other and they heal. And if anything, you will be stronger in that place,
Yeah.
in the broken place. And I think the psyche is rather like that if you can get out the toxicity and have ways of getting rid of, I don't know what you would even call it, pain, angst, trauma, the psyche does know how to heal itself, that there's a natural state.
Yeah. Just trust your intuition.
Yes. I think your intuition is so important.
Yeah. Trust your intuition and then find the space to be with the pain when it comes up.
Yeah. And it'll be different at different times. If you can through meditation one time, it'll be sitting, it'll be through psychodrama, it'll be through EMDR, parts work, whatever.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Tian.
Yeah. Wonderful. I've so enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed it. Is there anything that we've not touched on that you would have liked to have talked about in terms of your work?
Well, first of all, I think, excuse me, you're so emotionally literate. I think you're an example of something that is changing in the world. That your level, you could be a psychologist, you could be a therapist, you know what I mean? Your level of personal understanding. So I think that is one takeaway. Do what you've done, because look how much you know. And a lot of therapists don't know what you know because they haven't gone through something themselves.
Yeah.
So there's that. And that would be my work in that you would be an example of. Not that I worked with you, but do you know what I mean? That's where you want somebody to get as a psychologist. And then I think the RTR sociometric, I'd love people to, if they're curious, just log on to that website and watch the psychodramas and see, or I've got a lot on my website, tiandayton.com also, but it's better organized on RTR sociometric. Just see how it feels. See how it feels to watch them, because I think that's a way of healing too.
Yeah.
I have some downloads on there that maybe help work through things, I think.
And that's what's great about this era as well. Is a lot of they talk about bibliotherapy, right? You read the right book and you'll have some response and feel something. But now, of course, for people who don't read, we've got all of these new opportunities.
It's remarkable. I mean, I think you could go on the internet and find tremendous healing.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we'll make sure we put the link to RTRS, right? Relational Trauma Repair Sociometrics.
One other thing, can I talk about two books that might?
Yes.
I have two books that are about sociometrics. One's called Sociometrics and one's Relational Trauma Repair. No, treating adult children of traumas. Sorry. But then I have a workbook, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Adult Relational Trauma, that if anybody's struggling with stuff, I have tried to talk about it, describe it, and line out a lot of exercises it's a soft entry into this kind of work that you can just do yourself.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll make sure we put links to those books specifically in the description as well. All right. Well, and to your website and the RTRS website. Brilliant. Okay. Well, I guess it just leaves me to say thank you. Thank you for being so generous in sharing your story and your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on your excellent podcast.
Brilliant. Thank you.